acknowledges that we are meeting on the traditional country of the Awabakal and Worimi peoples. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs, and continuing relationship with the land, and they are the proud survivors of more than 200 years of dispossession. Council reiterates its commitment to address disadvantages and attain justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this community. Almighty God, we humbly ask you to bless this meeting, direct and prosper our deliberations for the advancement of your glory and the true welfare of the people of Newcastle. Ladies and gentlemen, will you honour the memory of those who served and died, that we might meet here in peace? Thank you, councillors. Do I have any apologies or leave of absence? I can't see an indication for any, so I will just move on. Are there any declarations of pecuniary or non-pecuniary interest? Councillor Barth?
Thanks, Lord Mayor. Mine's in relation to our DA meeting. Item 14, I'll declare a significant non-pecuniary interest, and we'll be managing that by exiting the video link chat.
Thank you. What I will do is I'll just note it. We're in Public Voice Committee, and when we close this, we will go into DAC. So I'll just ask you to restate for DAC as well, similar to the councillor last week. Is there any further declarations? I'm noting that we're in Public Voice Committee, and when we go into DAC, I'll call again for declaration, so you still have an opportunity in that section as well. There being none, what I'll do is I'll move straight on to our first item on the agenda, which is DA 2019/2019-01284, 16 Northwood Street, Adamstown. And I'm going to request that Council Services admit the speakers for this item. And I would like to take the opportunity to welcome the speakers for item 1. We have Owen Jackson and Jason Young to answer questions, and they have provided also a PowerPoint. The objectors, Mr. Young and Mr. Jackson, will give us a 10-minute presentation, and then I will ask the applicant, Mr. Stuart Campbell and Chris Speak, who have also provided a presentation to us for 10 minutes. And at the close of both presentations, just like our normal process, I'll open up to questions from councillors of our 4 presenters. So to get moving, I can see that we have Owen Jackson. Welcome to our Public Voice this evening. It's great to have you. I will hand over to yourself and also to Jason Young to answer any questions if needed. So welcome, and please begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much. So good evening, Lord Mayor and councillors, and thank you for the opportunity to address council regarding this matter. Firstly, I'd like to make sure that you're well aware of the details within the NLEP. I'd just like to highlight some key clauses that Valley Planning has used in this development application. So clause 2.6, the subdivision consent requirements, minimum lot size for an R2 zone is 400 metres squared, whereas this development has all lot smaller than 400 metres squared. And then clause 4.1a, exemptions to the minimum lot size. Item 1, the objective of this clause is to encourage housing diversity without adversely impacting on residential amenities. Obviously, this can apply in an R2 zone. And then 3b, the erection of an attached dwelling, a semi-detached dwelling, or a dwelling house on each lot resulting from the subdivision that does not have an existing dwelling on it. Next slide, please. Did you get that? Yep. Okay, great. So our interpretation of part 4.1a clause 3 indicates that the erection of a house can only be on the lot subdivided if there is no existing dwelling on those subdivided lots. The proposed subdivision will not adhere to this clause, as the subdivision will include the existing house on all lots. From the developer's response, it does not appear that he has properly read section 4.1a of the NLEP, meaning that the exemption will not apply to the developer. Further, if you have a look at the relevant lot size map for our area, it states that there is a minimum lot requirement of 400 metres squared. Therefore, I feel that council ought not to grant the application for a lot size of less than 400 metres squared unless section 4.6 is satisfied. Further, reviewing the report from Valley Planning, it is conceded that the floor space ratio does not comply with the relevant standards. Again, council ought not to grant the application to allow the build outside of the floor space ratio unless section 4.6 is satisfied. Next slide, please. So section 4.6, development consent must not be granted for a development that contravenes a development standard unless the developer demonstrates the elements outlined in sections 4.63 and 4.64. We can see it from the extract below. So item 3, unless the consent authority has considered a written request from the applicant that seeks to justify the contravention of the development standard by demonstrating the compliance with the development standard is unreasonable or unnecessary in the circumstances of the case, and that there is sufficient environmental planning grounds to justify contravening the development standard. And the word, I'd like to emphasise sufficient here. Next slide, please. The use of the word "and" between clauses 4.63a and 4.63b means that the developer must demonstrate and provide written submission with respect to both criteria. Consent must not be provided unless this occurs. The developer has failed to demonstrate the criteria above and has not addressed whether compliance to the standard is unreasonable or unnecessary. So I'll reiterate, the burden is upon the developer to establish the relevant criteria and justify that compliance to the development standard is unreasonable or unnecessary, and there are sufficient environmental planning grounds to justify contravening the development standard. So if council were to grant this particular development application in breach of the R2 zoning requirements, it would set a precedent in the area of Adamstown Heights for other developers to rely upon this particular development to satisfy an exemption to the R2 zoning. Next slide, please. So in relation to providing housing diversity, there is an R3 zone located within 650 metres of this site. The closest of the R3 zone, which sees a high number of diverse housing options, such as townhouses and apartments, does not warrant the use of this clause in this location. There is already housing diversity in close vicinity. So I feel that council has responded to the state planning direction, which seems to be the only reason provided to justify such a proposal, as it can be seen from the latest statement by Valley Planning, if you want to have a read of A and B. So when you're ready, you can go to the next slide. So this is the R3 zoning, obviously close to Katara Shops and the station. And where, I suppose, if you see down the bottom of the map there, Adamstown Heights in the green, we're just on the other side of that park there. Next slide, please. So I'll refer to the above case in reference to the matter, and hopefully the council will regard the same. So with reference to Jay Payne's decision, his honours findings that the word sufficient in clause 4.63b is a high threshold to meet. His honour also found that clause 4.33b requires that an applicant for development consent to show that environmental planning grounds exist, particular to the circumstances of this proposed development on the subject site. So it does not appear that the developer has satisfied the relevant criteria to allow for an exemption under section 4.6, specifically in respect to the minimum subdivision lot size requirement. So therefore, I feel that consent to contravene the standard but must be provided unless the criteria in section 4.6 are established, and as the developer has failed to address the relevant criteria, consent must not be provided for the development application as submitted. Next slide, please. So I'll just now run through some of the other concerns that the residents have about this building development, I suppose. So the intensity of the development, we also feel, will adversely impact on the residential amenities. The increase in bulk and height will shroud the immediate neighbours in overly large and close buildings. It will also increase traffic in an already busy area and raises safety concerns to the development, obscuring the junction of both roads. So what I'd propose that a street vista view of both Northwood Street and Corriston Crescent would highlight just how far these dwellings are protruding into the current landscape and just how out of character they are and adversely impacting on the existing residential amenities. I feel that the omission of such a drawing is telling. The developer should provide these images for consideration for a DA application. So we feel the building style does not fit in with the structure of the surrounding streets, which I assume is why the clause for a minimum lot size of 400 square metres would be required, because it's more in line with the existing surroundings. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this is the image of 28 Corriston Crescent and how it's dominated and loomed upon by the proposed structure. Next slide, please. And then this is 14 Northwood Street, which is my house, when the front setback is a long way in front, and it also kind of dominates the streetscape from my end. Next slide, please. So this is a really good one. You can see obviously the existing houses in the area and the lot sizes we all have. And then you can see the intensity of the development here, where effectively you're putting in 13 warm beds. I think all are proposed to have a double garage, which potentially could mean 8 cars in a very tight and small corner block. You could probably stay on this slide. The next 2 slides just refer again to the front and back setbacks. Again, they kind of protrude quite far into the street and don't really take the average size. So you could go to the next slide if you'd like. Okay, so the front setback, so it wasn't really adhered to. And then the next slide, please. And the rear setbacks, again, it kind of impedes on and kind of is outside of the standard, again, in the DCP for townhouse 1 and 2. And the last slide, please. So overall, we feel that the building does not harmonise or have a character that is sympathetic to the residential development. So look, ultimately, in summation, my main point is the minimum lot size requirement. I feel that 4.6 has not been satisfied, and until the developer satisfies that criteria, where the threshold there is a high standard to meet the requirements for allow the council to obviously to address the relevant criteria, so the consent must be provided to 4.6. So anyway, I'll kind of leave it there. So hopefully I feel that the development application as it stands needs to be revised and resubmitted with hopefully the minimum lot size requirement put into effect. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. I just note that Mr. Young is not presenting as well. He's just answering questions. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Great. So I will hand over to the DA applicants,
Yep.
Mr. Stuart Campbell and Mr. Chris Speak for their presentation. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Chris, I think you're starting with this.
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I was just initially just have a quick response back to Mr. Jackson's comments. I noticed that a lot of his concerns and focus seems to be around applying what we'd call a 4.6 variation to clause 4.1A or 2.6. This isn't the case. The correct application, we're not asking a 4.6 variation to the subdivision. The 4.1A has been set up to facilitate 200 square metre minimum lot sizes, as long as it comes along with a development application at the same time for individual dwellings to be created on the site. It's to prevent vacant lot subdivisions going below the 400 square metres. So the correct terminology would be that we are compliant with 4.1A and we're not seeking a variation to anything in the LEP on that aspect of subdivision. The second part is that the only 4.6 variation we sought is a 1.6% increase in the FSR. And this is to cater for much more additional off-street car parking because of the amount of car spaces that we're providing in addition to the council's minimum requirements. We're well in excess, therefore it adds to the FSR calculation. The major other LEP control is to do with height, which is 8.5 in this area, and we're at 7.7, which is below. If I could move into our presentation, slide 1 is just a brief introduction slide. So if I jump to slide 2, please. This is, again, same as Mr. Jackson's slide, just an extract of the LEP controls over the site. Excuse me for a second. The site is addressed as 14 Northwood Street, Adamstown Heights, and it's located on the corner with Corriston Avenue, which leads to the preschool, and Katara High School, which caters for 1,000 place 7 to 12. The site's within an R2 zone site, correctly identified, and it's a form of multi-dwelling housing, which is permissible land use in the zone. The land use is supported by the controls in the DCP, meets the controls, definition and objectives in the LEP, which in providing a diversity of housing forms and to provide for the housing needs within a low density zone. It is well documented that the proposal has been well thought out. We have not only met the DCP and LEP controls, but we have undertaken significant effort to work within the parameters outlined in these controls to create a positive built form in this part of Adamstown Heights that was predominantly designed in the 1960s. If we can move to slide 3, please, the next slide. As nominated on this slide, the change in topography, the cars on street from the school overflow, the open frontages of the single dwellings with their generous front setbacks are definitely a local dominant character, again, created from the 1960s suburbs. We are in 2020 at the moment, and the images show that with the age of the area, the established garden trees are in the process of being removed, replaced, altered. Ad hoc landscaping features such as the brick walls on that image, carports and the like have made their way into this setback. If we could move to slide 4, please. You'll see that this is an extract from the Xeriscapes landscape overview. The design's heavily focused on this character that I described. We maintained the garden dominance with the reintroduction of a strong landscape corner element. The dwellings are formed within 3 blocks to reflect and repeat the dwelling pattern of the street. Over generous on-site car parking provision retains vehicles off-street and retains on-street car parking for school overflows. I can just finish on slide 5 for myself. This moves into the same layout, but just for the ground level of the development. Again, landscape is a corner focus that's been identified, and the stepping of the design on Corriston respects that established front setback to blend in with the rest of the street. I'll pass you on to the architect, Mr. Stuart Campbell. He'll continue the discussion on the architectural detail.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for that overview. I'll just speak briefly about the design layout and the site in general. I'm really familiar with the area, having grown up just around the corner and also went to that high school. So I'm familiar with that site for a long time. We used to cut across that yard out the front. So it's something that, yeah, we're aware of the area, we're aware of the vernacular of the built form around, and we're aware of what would be an improvement to it in terms of new built form. We chose this because it is a corner site. It does provide the opportunity for good quality built form that is of its day. In this, we've chosen to orientate backyards as best we can to get northern light, and we've consolidated these 4 dwellings into 3 buildings. So that's seen as 2, let's say, duplex style dwellings that are attached on the northern end of the site with large rear backyards in excess of the minimum required by the DCP. Those 2 buildings stagger their way along Corriston Street, and Corriston Street continues to the north and then kinks around on the neighbouring lot and then ends at the high school and a childcare centre just before that. So there's I think maybe 2 or 3 dwellings, then you get to the childcare centre, then the mass of the school to the north of the site. So we have two dwellings joined that stagger and respond to the streetscape. They're a minimum of 5.5 metres from the front setback and then increase beyond that. Then we come around to a corner dwelling, which is maintaining a large landscaped area to Corriston Street. So a 2-metre setback, which is given over to public domain in keeping with the current situation that's there on Corriston Street, with a large front yard and a tree that people can just cut through. So we still provide some landscaping to Corriston Street and then some mediate that to some more private landscaping beyond. the garaging is pulled away from the street corner. As we said, it's a double garage for that dwelling as well as the one next door. And that's in excess of the one car park per dwelling that's required under the DCP, but it's in keeping with other garages in the area. It's also appropriate in terms of some of the concerns that have been raised around parking on the street and getting provision for cars off the street and safe vehicular movements. And that's what's increased our FSR slightly. We had to include a portion of those two double garages of the two dwellings that stand alone. Then moving up the street, up Northwood Street, there's the fourth dwelling. Again, double garage, clear entry point, and then a north-facing backyard with larger than the minimum in terms of private open space. In general, we're conscious of the area, we're conscious of the material palette, and that's what's informed our selection of materials, which we'll get to in a moment. However, the building forms celebrate the corner. They create a strong corner element that responds to other corner elements. So, for example, at the top of Northwood Street on the corner of Northwood and Madison Drive, it is closer to the corner than the established setback further down. So we have a different condition on a corner, and good urban planning would suggest that it is good practice to celebrate a corner and define a corner. And then, as Chris pointed out, across the road on Northwood Street, there's a brick fence that's quite dominant. So there's a series of things that have happened over time, including the carport to the west of us at number 14 Northwood Street. Maybe next slide. Elevations. So this is showing generally the relationship on Northwood Street in the top image. So we've got the two dwellings that step their way down towards Corriston Street. The scale of those dwellings in relation to number 14 Northwood Street. The red dashed line is the 8.5 metre height limit. So you can see we're well underneath that. We're strengthening the corner, but then we step down. So we step down to a single story element of a masonry construction, again in keeping with the area, masonry on ground, lightweight above. And then coming further towards 14 Northwood Street, we have a two-story element with the garage underneath, an entry defined, and then a single story element stepping its way down to Northwood Street. So you can see the amount of blue sky and distance on particularly the second level between our boundary and our neighbour. And then again on the corner, the boundary and our dwelling, we've got a large amount of blue sky, which we've shown a tree canopy in there, which will be replacement planting for the large needle pine that's there at the moment. The drawing below shows the cut through the site. So this is showing how we're stepping the forms down with the topography. Again, I think it's important to point out the height of the building, well below the 8.5 metre height limit. Good space between the dwellings, all compliant with the relevant codes and controls, and a large setback to Northwood Street. That's 14 Northwood Street, I should say. Next slide, please. So Corriston Street, the neighbour on Corriston Street to the north of us, of which we just see a portion of that, the boundary comes across it and then kinks away back up to the school. We're showing a 5.5 metre setback. The DCP calls up a 4.5 metre minimum setback. So we're beyond that. And then we come around to the corner and maintain that 5.5 metre setback generally. And then we step the Corriston Street duplex style dwellings to respond to that splayed street frontage. The elevation shown in the corner there, but the elevation flat on is a very technical drawing. It's probably best illustrated in the next image on the next slide. Showing how those dwellings step back. And we're keeping this all pretty simple. The material palette's very simple and deliberately so. We've got no landscaping in this image. All we're trying to do is illustrate that we're showing a masonry base, a lightweight upper story. The roof forms will follow the street as it steps down. They're quite simple, but they're modern, and that's deliberately so. We have an eclectic array of additions around the area, a school at the end, a kindergarten. We're on a corner, but our material palette is something that does maintain that thread of the area. So brick base, lightweight, above. I think that's probably it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that presentation to both Stuart Campbell and Chris Speak. And obviously, I'll just invite Owen Jackson, Jason Young, Stuart Campbell and Chris Speak to answer any questions that councillors might have from both of those presentations. So I'll open it up to councillors. Are there any questions? I can't see anyone raising their hand. I'll just check if the chat has got any councillors' names. Speak now. They're both very comprehensive presentations, so I can't see that councillors have any questions based on no one putting their hand up. So that's a testament to all of the presenters tonight. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Having the detailed presentations both in PowerPoint form is actually very helpful in communicating what your issues are or what is entailed in the development. I think it was made very clear on for both parties. The final report to council will actually address the concerns and also the presentation by the applicant here this evening. So thank you very much for your time. It's very much appreciated. And
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you, everybody.
And what I would do is that's actually our only item for Public Voice Committee this evening. So what I'll do is I'll close the Public Voice Committee meeting at 6:31 p.m. And in doing so, I will now at the same time open up our Development Application Committee meeting at the same time. And I note that we're opening up at 6:31 p.m. and the meeting for the DAC this evening is being held remotely via Zoom. And as with the Public Voice previously, this meeting is also live streamed and accessible on Council's website. So again, I'll ask for any apologies or leave of absence if there are any. There being none, I'll ask again now for declarations of pecuniary or non-pecuniary interests that pertain to the DAC agenda. I know Councillor Winnie Bart's had one.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'd just like to declare a significant non-pecuniary interest in item 14, the DA of 25 Llewellyn Street, and I'll be managing that by leaving the Zoom meeting.
Thank you. Is that Councillor Dunn?
Yeah, thank you, Lord Mayor. I'd like to declare a non-pecuniary interest in item number 15. I have a client with properties in the vicinity, so I won't be taking part in that decision.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other declarations? I can't see anyone raising their hand, or I can't see a councillor. Oh, Councillor Church.
Lord Mayor, I'd like to declare a less than significant non-pecuniary interest in DA 01146, that's item 16. I own property in Broadmeadow, but I will be staying in the chamber.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other declarations? There being none that I can see, councillors indicating, I will move on to the confirmation of the previous minutes from the DAC meeting on the 28th of April. Do I have a mover of those minutes? Councillor Mackenzie, seconded Councillor Byrne. All those in favour, please raise your hand. All those against, I declare that motion carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. We'll move just straight through the agenda in order. The first item, item number 11, DA 2019/01176, 16 Curry Street, Merriweather, dwelling house alterations and additions. Do I have a mover of the motion? Councillor Mackenzie. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Winnie Barts. Would anyone like to speak? Would you like to speak, Councillor Mackenzie, as a mover of the motion?
Yes, thank you, Lord Mayor. Just really quickly, this is a small deck addition any of the variances were already pre-existing within the property, so there's no issue in relation to this fairly minor addition to the property.
Thank you, councillor. Are there any other speakers? If there are no other speakers, would you like a right of reply, councillor Mackenzie? I'll put the motion as moved and seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. I will take it via division. So that's Councillor Luke, Councillor Robinson, Councillor Winnie Bartz, Councillor Duncan, Councillor White, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Dunn, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Church, Councillor Byrne, Councillor Nelms. As there are no votes against, I declare that motion carried. Our councillors will move on to item 12, DA 2019/00852 6 King Street, Stockton, multi-dwelling house and strata subdivision. Do I have a mover of the motion? Councillor Clausen. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Byrne. Would you like to speak to the motion, councillor?
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Happy to speak in favour of this motion. Councillors will recall that this item came to Public Voice Committee. The report documents a number of changes that have been made to this development proposal since it came to Public Voice. In particular, some changes that address the neighbourhood concerns, particularly in relation to the impacts on adjoining properties for privacy and landscaping, and the inclusion of acoustic glazing on the northern windows and additional landscaping, as well as councils will recall there was a query regarding the maintaining the existing fence, and there's confirmation that that will be kept. So I'm comfortable that this is a proposal where the public voice process has worked well, where there's been a range of concessions made, and we now have a supportable proposal before us.
Thank you, councillor. Are there any other speakers for or against the motion? If there are no other speakers, would you like a right of reply, councillor? I'll put the motion as moved and seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. I'll take it by division, so just bear with me. Councillor Robinson, Councillor Luke, Councillor Winnie Bartz, Councillor Duncan, Councillor White, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Dunn, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Church, Councillor Byrne. All those against, please raise your hand. Councillor Mackenzie. I declare that motion carried. Councillors, I'll move on to item 13, DA 2019/01163, 43 Greenleaf Road, Kooragang, industrial erection and operation of warehouse and distribution centre. Do I have a mover of the motion? Councillor Luke. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Byrne. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Luke?
No, Lord Mayor.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers for or against the motion? Councillor Clausen.
Lord Mayor, given nobody else is willing to speak, I'm very happy to speak in favour of the motion and the report before us. This is a substantial additional portside development relating to the import and export of grain. The report goes through in quite a bit of detail some of the concerns that were had by objectors, including in relation to the road impacts and the like. RMS have come back and supported the proposal. It's a substantial development, $16 million in total value. The report outlines the job creation and the like. It's within the existing port lease area and is important portside operation. So happy to support the report.
Thank you, councillor. Are there any other speakers for or against the motion? If there are no other speakers, would you like a right of reply, councillor Luke? I'll put the motion as moved and seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Church, Councillor Byrne, Councillor Duncan, Councillor White, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Dunn, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Robinson, Councillor Luke, Councillor Winnie Bartz, Councillor Nelms. There are no votes against, so I declare that motion carried. Councillors, we're up to item 14. DA 2019/01255, 25 Llewellyn Street, Merriweather, veterinary practice. Do I have a mover of the motion? We're up to item 14, 25 Llewellyn Street, Merriweather. Do I have a mover of the motion? Councillor Mackenzie? Do I have a seconder? Councillor Clausen. Would you like to speak to the motion, councillor?
Just briefly, Lord Mayor, thank you. I'm moving this because I think obviously it's a critical item to debate. I think this has we've had quite a detailed look at this through the public voice and in workshop meetings. I think the key outstanding question really is the extent to which this proposed development is consistent with and acceptable in the context of a residential development. For me, the question comes down to, as someone who, if I was in the position where I had purchased property in the existing residential area, would I have a reasonable expectation that an adjoining property would have, among other things, use of overnight boarding for animals? I recognise that there's fairly detailed work done from the applicant in terms of a management plan surrounding that. And I recognise that as much provision as possible has been made. This is not a completely unique development. This sort of developments do take place in residential areas. On balance, I guess the question remains as to whether or not we feel it is consistent, given that it is not explicitly listed as one of the land uses that is available in the area. Thank you, Lord Mayor.
Thank you, councillor. Is there further discussion, councillors? Councillor Rufo.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I've just got a couple of questions. Well, more of just for clarification, if I could address these to Manager for Regulatory Planning and Assessment, Michelle Bisson, through you, Lord Mayor. I have been speaking with Michelle over the last few days about this, but some other points that I just wanted clarification on, if possible. The first being in point 10 of the conditions to be satisfied for approval, it speaks about the upgrading of the ceiling to increase the reduction of noise, which is great. Does that include the whole premises? So including the grooming area for the dogs is my first question. Would you like me to ask one at a time, or just stop and then ask the next one? What's easier for you?
We might do just one at a time if that's easier.
Yep.
We'll ask the managers. I can see her on the Zoom meeting.
Through you, Lord Mayor, the condition relates to the whole of the office, the commercial premise, so the whole roof, ceiling, sorry.
No, thank you. Second question, I couldn't see, something was raised with me this afternoon, and looking through the conditions, I couldn't see it being covered, and that is the use of the courtyard by the clinic. Are the animals going to be walked, paraded, have access to the courtyard, or is that going to be restricted?
I'll put the question through, but I'm pretty sure that got covered off in the public voice session last time we were in chambers.
Recall, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. I think it was a strong no, but I'll just put it through.
Again, through you, Lord Mayor, yes, the common area, the courtyard area is common area of the strata premise, and is not considered to be part of this application, and the animals will not be sort of be utilising that area.
Okay, excellent. An area that we spoke about this afternoon, the car parking. So my understanding is that there are 6 car spots that have been designated for the clinic. One of the issues that the tenants have is in relation to the lift, and obviously the animals being carted up and down in the lift, and perhaps wing or whatever in the lift. Is it, as we discussed this afternoon, putting an additional condition that stipulates that the car spots that have been allocated, 6 car spots allocated, are for staff use only? By doing this, it's going to, councils, it's going to alleviate the possibility of customers and their pets actually having to use a lift, because they'll have access to the vet straight off the street rather than going into the car park. Having said that, the car park is a secure car park, so that the only way they can get in there is by being allowed in entry by the vet itself. So can we, add that as another condition, that we specify the car spots are for the staff only?
I'll put that question through to our manager, and and this issue did get raised also, I think, in the public voice around how this could be managed.
Through you again, Lord Mayor, the requirement of the proposed development on the members, staff members, 2 practitioners and 4 additional staff. So that development, in accordance with our development control plan, requires 6 car parking spaces, which accommodates 2 visitor spaces. They do provide 6 car parking spaces in the basement. Councillor Rufo is correct, and it was discussed in public voice that it is a secure car park. With 6 staff being on the site in operation, then I had a discussion with our engineer coordinator this afternoon, and it sort of, I guess, works out to be same in the fact that if there was 2 customers using the 6 car parking spaces with 4 staff, when we actually need 6 staff, sorry, it was 2 practitioners, 4 additional staff, so 6 staff, then that would actually result in 2 staff being on the street. So therefore, if the condition was endorsed to be amended to be for staff only, then it still would result in 2 car parking spaces utilising the street. So as far as council's assessment's concerned, we would be satisfied with the condition being amended to say for staff only for the basement car parking.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. With that in mind, could I ask the mover and the seconder to perhaps consider, and I don't know if this is the time to do it, Lord Mayor, but to consider that as an addition to the item.
No, this is definitely, this is the right time. If the mover and the seconder are happy to take your suggested changes on as part of the motion, then that can become the motion. If they're not sure, given we maybe haven't completed the debate, you can also move it as an amendment, and we can debate that concurrently with a substantive motion to see if that is an outcome that is going to get any net benefit or not, or if those restrictions are going to be detrimental in some way in terms of broader impact on the residential area.
Happy to do that, Lord Mayor.
So I can put it to the
amendment.
Would you prefer to do that?
Yeah. Sorry, Councillor Mackenzie wanted to say something.
Did you want to accept it as part of the motion, Councillor?
Sorry, I'm just not completely clear on what the amendment is. I'm sorry. Councillor Rufo, could you just clarify exactly what the amendment is?
The amendment being that an additional condition is that the 6 car spots that have been allocated to the DA for use of staff only. By doing that, the way I see it is that it alleviates the possibility for customers to have to enter the car park and therefore having the need to use the lift. When visiting the clinic, they can go straight in from street level. There will be no need for any pets to use the lift at any time, and therefore alleviate the possibility of accidents happening in the lift.
Is that something you wanted to take on as part of the motion, Councillor Mackenzie?
I'm happy for that to be included as a condition.
Who was the seconder? Councillor Clausen, was it? Did you want to include that as part of the motion, Councillor?
Happy to include. Apologies, Lord Mayor. Would it be possible just to get Ms. Bisson's comment on the workability of including that as a condition?
Through you, Lord Mayor. Sorry.
If the councillors wanted to have a further discussion, it can become part of the motion towards the end of the debate, and it can be moved officially as an amendment now. And then maybe it can be debated concurrently rather than trying to determine that one particular aspect of the development. So I think I'll just suggest to move it as an amendment, and then we can go back and forth whether or not it's going to form part of the final motion with the mover and seconder. So if that's moved by Councillor Rufo, I just need a seconder. Councillor Elliott. Sorry, Councillor Mackenzie, I can't have you second as the mover. Councillor Elliott is seconding. So we have the amendment and we had the substantive motion, which could be joined together. Is there any further parts of this you'd like to speak to, Councillor?
Sorry, Lord Mayor, just one more. In the conditions during operations and use of the development, it specifies that overnight housing would be limited to 3 dogs and 12 cats. Now, my question was that the part of the application, or was that a condition that we've put on the DA?
Ms. Bisson?
Through you, Lord Mayor, the statement of environmental effects that accompanied the application detailed that there would be cat boarding as an ancillary development between 4 and 12 cats, and that there would be dogs that would stay overnight due to surgery. So this is just to reinforce by condition of consent of what they've detailed in their application.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you for your patience, everybody. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rufo. I have a call from Councillor Church, who would like to speak.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, and thank you to Councillor Rufo for working through some potential amendments that might ameliorate some of the residents' concerns. My view is that this change of use shouldn't be approved because the residents who occupy these apartments, and there's 35 apartments in this complex, purchased under the understanding that they were going to have commercial space that was probably going to be used for offices or retail or maybe a coffee shop. And I think they've been blindsided by this change of use. And I acknowledge that a vet perhaps in just being used for normal office hours wouldn't have a major impact, but the inclusion of animal grooming, cat boarding and dog run rooms is a significant change from the normal B1 use that we approve for such commercial spaces. And it should be noted that pet grooming and cat boarding are not permitted in a B1 zoning, and I'm not swayed by the argument that it's an ancillary use and therefore should be accepted. I acknowledge that the proposed plan of management seeks to address the residents' concerns, and I thank both staff and the applicant for working through that detail. But this has the potential to become also a running dispute between residents and the clinic. This could have the effect of creating an unhappy community in the building, and the breaches of any plan of management could become an ongoing sore point. And who wants to approve that as a councillor? I certainly don't. We need to recognise that this complex has a very high residential component. There's 35 apartments and 6 commercial units. In many buildings, strata laws actually manage not only the number of pets, but the size of the pets, and sometimes even ban pets from residential complexes because of the concerns around cleanliness, noise, unsocial behaviour. And this proposal, I think, doesn't recognise those concerns in consideration for the residents. I'm pleased that we're looking at some amendments to the car parking because being behind closed doors and an automated fob would be very strange for clients to be attending, parking their cars undercover and then using a lift with animals, both there and back. And I can't support this change of use application, Lord Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I find this very difficult, DA. I went out and visited the site with a resident early on to have a look at it, and I would have to agree with Councillor Church's comments that it doesn't appear to be a compatible development with residential. There have been a number of concerns that have been raised by the residents, which I think are quite valid in terms of noise of cats being boarded overnight, the possibility of dogs having accidents or cats having accidents in lifts that are being jointly used by residents who would be, you know, quite dismayed to be getting into a lift if that had happened. I noticed also that the plan of management has introduced a number of phone numbers for people to call if there's excessive noise. There'll be additional cleaning of the lifts and common areas and that sort of thing. But I guess my question about that is that if the plan of management is not adhered to and we get complaints from the residents, what is it that we can, my question is to Ms. Bisson, what is it that we will be able to do about that if in fact the plan of management is not complied with? Will we be actively going out there and doing anything? What are our obligations to the residents if they don't get any responses or they don't get satisfactory responses from the vet clinic if there are potential issues?
I'll put that question through to Ms. Bisson.
Through you, Lord Mayor, the plan of management is proposed to be an approved document. So as per development consents, it is an approved document. People are required to comply with approved plans, approved traffic management plans, construction management plans, and this is a similar mechanism with regard to the plan of management. So therefore, if they do not comply with the plan of management, then they are breach of their development consent and regulatory action can occur.
Thank you for that. Look, I'm also wanting to talk to the amendment, if that's possible. I've supported if this development is voted up today, that I have supported the car parking being only used for staff, because I think that does assist to ameliorate the issue of dogs and cats having accidents in the lift. So that interaction between residents and animals is certainly mitigated by that. But I feel very uncomfortable about a vet clinic being in a residential building. I don't think the uses are compatible. Thank you, Lord Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Luke.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Look, I've got grave concerns with this development. My concerns really fit around the fact that it is residential, but particularly the plan of management. It's wonderful to have a plan of management, but my experience has been that they're not that practically enforceable. It's wonderful to say that they must be complied with, but I think over the years I've seen experiences of where simply there isn't compliance. One side claims there is compliance, and it's almost impossible to prove whether or not the person has complied completely with it. And from a practical point of view, the council usually doesn't want to know about these sort of items after the development's gone through, and there's very little that can be done later to enforce the plan of management. So I don't have confidence that that can actually be worked in this sort of facility in this way to the benefit of the residents in that building. So I won't be supporting the DA.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Duncan.
Lord Mayor, thank you. Following on from some of the comments that the other councillors have made, particularly about the plan of management, I think the plan of management itself is strong, and I think supporting new businesses in our city is incredibly important. But if I could ask through you, what sort of penalties are in place for breaches of a plan of management?
I'll put that question through to Mrs. Bisson.
Through you, Lord Mayor, there is mechanisms with regard to fines. There's development orders. You can even go all the way to the Land and Environment Court with developments that are in accordance with, within breaches, I guess, of the development consent. I will just sort of make note that there are conditions proposed as well that would sort of go towards acoustic concerns, parking, and hours of operations, limited of number of cats. So there's some of the things that are mentioned in the plan of management, but they're also, I guess, backed up in proposed conditions of consent.
Thank you. Councillor Duncan.
Lord Mayor, yeah, I do tend to be concerned that this may be
Has Councillor Duncan frozen for everybody else?
at this council.
Councillor Duncan, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to have to ask you to repeat your last part of what you were saying. You froze at the very start. So we heard the question answer, but we didn't hear anything from then on.
Lord Mayor, yes, thank you. I think my concern is, again, that any lapses in management or observance of the plan of management would leave this with the potential to become an ongoing problem for residents and for the people who are trying to operate and run what should be a wonderful business. And I do have concerns that this could be something that creates ongoing issues unless we have absolute confidence that the plan of management won't actually be breached and won't require regulatory action.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor White.
Thanks, Lord Mayor. I probably agree with a lot of the comments that have been made tonight. I think it is a difficult one. I think that we saw during the presentation that, you know, the developers and the owners, the vets, have made a lot of effort to try and address all of the issues and the concerns. And I appreciate the work that the staff have done in terms of the plan of management. But I also agree that we're then sort of left where, if it happens, that we've got to try and backtrack from there. And given the size of the residential area, I think that Councillor Church, in terms of, I guess, what the expectations of residents would be about what would go in there, I think that is an important point. And I think that really, for me, the overnight boarding becomes problematic, even with the plan of management and the acoustics and things that both the applicant as well as the staff have tried to work on. I think that if it was just a daytime operation, I think that there would be a lot more, for the residents would be a lot more comfortable, and I think that I would be as well. So I agree, I have some difficulties with it as it is at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there any further discussion from councillors? Did we want to address whether or not the mover and seconder wanted to accept the amendment by Councillor Rufo and Councillor Elliott around the parking? And Councillor Mackenzie's nodding. Did you want to as well, Councillor Clausen?
Happy to include it, Lord Mayor.
Your questions were answered through the discussion?
Yes, thanks.
Great. Okay, so the amendment becomes part of the motion. Is there any further discussion? Or did you have a part of discussion to add, or did you want to close the debate, Councillor?
I was going to close the debate, but I'm happy for anyone else to speak, Lord Mayor.
Okay, I'll just check first. Just give me a moment to scan the screen. Just make sure everyone's had an opportunity to speak. I'll hand over to you, Councillor, to close the discussion.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I think the amendment, I do note that the proponent was fairly clear that they were anticipating very minimal use of the lifts by customers, but I think the amendment now serves to give us a bit more assurity in that regard. I wanted to be clear that I've no objection to a veterinary hospital. In fact, it's quite consistent with the B1 zoning. I think that the issue here primarily relates to the animal boarding, which, as Councillor Church points out, is not permitted in the zoning. Well, it's not prohibited rather in the B1 zoning. However, if you look to the LEP, the areas where animal boarding is permitted, it's very clearly the intention is to have those in areas outside of residential and even to some extent outside of industrial areas. So that comes back to that question of whether or not the inclusion of boarding is consistent with the B1. And many of the speakers have raised the concerns around the incompatibility of land uses and the expectations of surrounding residents and business owners that when they purchased or engaged in leases or what have you, a certain degree of confidence in what else was going to be around them, which again, I think that the animal boarding component is not consistent with. I think it's very dangerous territory, however. I've heard some discussion about perhaps considering whether or not to approve a DA on the basis of whether or not the proponent may or may not breach the plan of management. I think that's not, for me, that's it's a very dangerous consideration in terms of how we make decisions about whether to approve developments or not. I have every confidence in the professionalism of this organisation, of who'll be running this operation. I have no reason to suspect that they would not meet with the expectations and with the conditions that are outlined in their plan of management. So for me, that's not at all a consideration. The question is whether or not the animal boarding component is consistent with the B1 zoning. And for me, at this stage, I would have to say that I do not believe that it is.
Certainly. Thank you. I will put the motion as moved and seconded and amended. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Councillor Nelms, Councillor Dunn, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Byrne. All those against, please raise your hand. Councillor Robinson, Councillor Luke, Councillor Rufo, Councillor White, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Church, Councillor Duncan. I declare the motion defeated. And that will move on to the next item on the agenda. And we'll just wait a moment because we need to invite one of the councillors back into the meeting.
Lord Mayor, point of clarification, please.
Yes.
Does that mean the DA is now deemed refused?
Yes.
So we don't need a motion to that effect?
We do. Ms. Pearson?
Through you, Lord Mayor, I propose that there will need to be an alternate resolution with reasons for refusal.
That is true. So we can do this now or we can do it later in the meeting. Is there a substantive motion being used moved by you, Councillor Church?
Lord Mayor, yes, I'm happy to move that the DA is not approved on the basis that it's incompatible with the B1 zoning. It doesn't take into consideration the amenity of the residents and also has issues around overnight boarding and pet grooming.
Do I have a seconder for that motion? Councillor Elliott? And I will ask if there's any discussion, councillors, on that substantive motion. If there's no discussion, would you like a right of reply, Councillor Church?
No, thank you, Lord Mayor.
I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Councillor Luke, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Robinson, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Church, Councillor Duncan. All those against, please raise your hand. Councillor Nelms, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Byrne. I declare that motion carried. Just want to make sure I captured all of the councillors on the meeting. We'll move on to the next item, but we just need to wait a moment while we add Councillor Winnie Bartz back to the meeting. I did see her enter. and she has returned. So everyone that has been excluded has been returned to the meeting. I'll move on to item 15, which is DA 2019/01000, 134 to 142 Derby Street, Cooks Hill, alterations and additions to the hotel. Do I have a mover of the motion? Councillor Luke, do I have a seconder? Councillor Church, thank you. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Luke?
No, not at this point, Lord Mayor.
Would you like to speak as seconder, Councillor Church?
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Just very briefly, I'm happy to support this DA. I perfectly understand the concerns of residents in Council Street. They live near licensed premises, and this particular hotel has been in the neighbourhood for a very long time. I think the convincing moment for me was the concession from the applicant that the doors would close from 10 p.m. and that includes not only the doors but also the hotel is a substantial business. It's an important landmark in our hospitality trade. I believe that there's no...
Okay, if there's no other speakers for or against the motion, would you like a right of reply, Councillor Luke?
No, Lord Mayor.
I'll just note that I did tell you all during public voice there was a door there, and I note it's in the report. I'll put the motion as moved and seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Take it by division. Councillor Luke, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor White, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Church, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Winnie Barts. All those against? Councillor Byrne. Sorry, I've just, one second, Councillor Church. I've just got, I've got one councillor, Councillor Robinson, who hasn't voted.
I voted for, sorry.
Okay, I just need you to, because we're on a screen, if everyone can just raise their hand and hold it while we're doing a division, it just makes it easier for me to go through. So I'll take it again. So all those for, please raise your hand. Councillor Robinson, Councillor Luke, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Winnie Barts, Councillor White, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Church. All those against? Councillor Byrne. Thank you. I declare that motion carried.
Excuse me, Lord Mayor, just before we move to the next item, can I please give notice of a motion to recommit item number 14? I'd like to explain the reasons, but potentially towards the end of the meeting, just before you close, just giving notice of that intent.
Okay. Item 16, DA 2019/01146, 106 Gosford Road, Adamstown, multi-dwelling housing, demolition of existing dwellings, erection of 12 dwellings and strata subdivision. Do I have a mover of the motion?
Excuse me, Lord Mayor, a couple of councillors appear to have dropped off. I'm wondering if they're still in the call. Just confirming they're still in the meeting.
Look, it's hard for me to tell, but I can, on this call in front of me now, I have yourself, Councillor Robinson, Councillor Luke, Councillor Rufo, Councillor White, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Winnie Barts, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Byrne and Councillor Church. Have I left anybody out that anyone can see?
I can't see Danny, can I?
He was here
Yeah, did see him earlier, yeah.
Earlier, but he might, it could be internet, I'm not sure, but I don't have a message that I know of.
Well, I think he declared an interest, didn't he, in this item? Was it? Is he?
Oh, he did. He did too. Yes, he did.
Might have vacated for this item only.
He did.
Yeah, potentially. I don't think he was in the previous item discussion either.
Okay.
So it could be that he went into the waiting room and is there, or I'm not sure. I don't have a message. Normally, when councillors have left, they often send me a message on the chat to say they have to leave. So I don't have anything. So I can't shed any light on that matter. But what I do have before me is a report from officers and a recommendation. So I just need to ascertain if there is a mover. Councillor Mackenzie. Is there a seconder? Councillor Duncan. Would you like to speak to the motion, Councillor Mackenzie?
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'll speak briefly just to start the debate. Obviously, we've had a lot of conversations. I think all councillors have been involved in conversations with surrounding residents. These are not uncommon circumstances in a growing city like Newcastle, where areas are undergrowing. Areas have been earmarked for growth expansion, and that's leading to a change in character and structure of neighbourhoods. Just before opening it up to debate, I just wanted to point out the significant changes that the proponent has made as a consequence of the public voice, the reducing of the bulk and scale, particularly at the rear from 3 stories down to 2 stories, the inclusion of additional privacy screenings, reducing the overshadowing as a consequence of that bulk and scale reduction, reduction as well in FSR, and also the increase in the landscaped area in the proposal. These are, I guess in proposals like this, we see the same issues arise in terms of character, bulk and scale, overshadowing, overdevelopment. I think the proponent has made a lot of concessions in relation to addressing some of those concerns, and that should be acknowledged. But in terms of a strict interpretation of the development controls, there's no issue with this particular proposal. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other? Councillor Duncan.
Just turning my microphone on, Lord Mayor, sorry. I actually intend to vote against this, and I have an alternate resolution for this one. I understand there's been a significant amount of work done by the proponent on this DA, but I have multiple reasons that I would actually recommend this DA for refusal at this point in its development.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Church.
I'd be very pleased to hear those amendments. I too find it difficult to support this DA application. I visited Gosford Street earlier today and noted that from memory and from times gone by that it's a quiet suburban street. Most of it is single or double story homes. What is being proposed is still a 3-story frontage to the street and a massing on the site that I believe is not sympathetic to the existing form and character of the local built environment. Many of the homes which border this development site will have a high wall built very close to their boundary, and this will impact on the amount of sunlight enjoyed in these traditional Aussie backyards. Many of the homes will lose privacy from the windows from the proposed development, many looking into their homes and backyards, not only on Gosford Road, but also Vera Street. It should always also be stated that this development is not 100% compliant. The report from the planners notes that the proposed rear setback does not comply with the 3-metre rear setback in some places, and that the requirement for landscaping falls short. Residents have also expressed to me and to others concerns about the loss of mature gum trees, which I believe are a valued part of our urban forest. And we know that there is a significant church across the road which holds regular community events, and that already puts a strain on parking in this small suburban street. And I share the residents' concerns that this development will only add to that loss of parking amenity. It's my view, Lord Mayor, that we need to increasingly examine not only just the built environment, but also the social impact of development applications. And the community has spoken clearly and expressed clearly the negative social impacts they believe this development would have on their neighbourhood. And I support their call for the existing DA approval for 8 units over 2 stories to remain as the preferred development on the site.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Elliott.
Yes, thank you, Lord Mayor. I can't support this development. I think that, like many other councillors, we've had quite a number of expressions of distress from residents, from the local church, from reasonable people who live in an environment which is going to change dramatically if this development is approved. The issues around privacy, around congestion, parking, change in the neighbourhood are all concerns that have been raised with me and all seem perfectly valid. I note also, as Councillor Church did, that this does not comply 100%, and that the residents are not actually opposed to development per se, they're just opposed to the size of the development. And I think when we're dealing with these kinds of development applications, to see neighbours who are reasonable and who are accepting of development, they just want it to be compatible and sensitive and sensible development. I think it's very encouraging to know that they are not fighting against a project in total. They're just being reasonable and expecting to have some reasonable amenity and lifestyle in there where they live. So I won't be able to be supporting this DA tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Clausen.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, and appreciate the comments of other councillors and listening to the debate. I have to admit that I also have concerns about this development, but note the comments that Councillor Mackenzie made originally when moving the motion about the number of concessions and changes that have been made to these plans since they were originally notified. You might recall I asked a question during the workshop discussion last week about whether it was possible to re-notify. Given that the substantive changes that have been made, I appreciate the comments from officers that it wasn't necessary, but I'd like to propose that we lay this item on the table and provide the opportunity for it to be re-notified, particularly so that the objectors, of which there was quite a number, there were 17 formal objections, 35 signatures on a petition, and I can count many dozens of emails in our inboxes from objectors, have the opportunity to look at the revised plans to make sure that when this comes to council, both councillors and the objectors have seen the most current form of this development. So with the consent of council, I'd like to see us laid on the table so that that process can happen before we make a decision on it.
Okay, so do you want to move that procedural motion now, or did you want to wait until some councillors had an opportunity to actually discuss?
Very happy to allow the debate to continue, but would flag an intent to move that prior to the end of discussion.
Okay, what I might do, just as a matter of process, rather than waiting to the end of the discussion, one of the councillors that has spoken against the current resolution before us, I might ask them to flag a substantive foreshadowed motion for refusal before we get to the end of the discussion. Councillor Elliott.
I'm happy to move or second that, Lord Mayor.
Yeah, me too, Lord Mayor.
Thank you. Do you have reasons for refusal?
Yeah, Councillor Church, did you move it? I should let you do it.
So yeah, I'm happy for you to, Councillor Church, to move a substantive foreshadowed motion with reasons for refusal.
Certainly, I'm happy to move that, Lord Mayor, and the reasons would be that this is an overdevelopment of the site, that there is a loss of privacy and sunlight for neighbours, that the development is not 100% compliant, and that approving it does not take on board the negative social impacts that have been expressed to us by residents.
Certainly, and that's seconded by Councillor Elliott. I've got also a note that Councillor Duncan also has an alternate resolution for refusal. You can move that as a substantive foreshadowed motion now as well. It means at least we have something for discussion if this motion fails.
Lord Mayor, thank you. My alternate resolution for refusal for this DA 2019/01146 for the following reasons. The proposed development is not consistent with the objectives of the R3 zone of the Newcastle LEP 2012 in that development will detract from the amenity of any existing nearby development and does not have regard to the desired future character. 2, the proposed development is not consistent with the provisions of Newcastle DCP 2012 with respect to setbacks and landscaping. 3, submissions received in response to public notification of the development application have raised issues of a nature and extent that establish that the proposed development will have unreasonable impacts in terms of character, bulk, scale and amenity impacts. And 4, the development is not in the public interest. and on this, added to this alternate resolution that those people who have made submissions be advised of the determination should that be supported by councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll take that as another foreshadowed substantive motion. Do I have a seconder for Councillor Duncan's motion? Sorry, I just need to grab a different councillor because Councillor Byrne, thank you. But we still have the substantive motion before us, but there's two substantive motions with reasons for refusal. So if this motion fails, that they are there, and we also have an intent from Councillor Clausen to re-notify, given that there has been significant changes from the last publicly notified development application amendment. Is there further discussion, councillors? I know that there, Councillor Elliott.
Lord Mayor, I just note that the comment you made about Councillor Clausen suggesting re-notification. I did think that we had asked the staff to do that last week, and I had assumed that that might have been done already. Am I? Is that an incorrect assumption?
What I'll do is I will put that through as a question to Ms. Bisson.
Through you, Lord Mayor, and after last month's public voice, last week's workshop, it was notified to the objectors that amended plans were submitted and a copy of the plans were given to them, and that it was coming to tonight's meeting of DAC. So yes, all objectors were notified that amended plans were provided.
Is there any further discussion? Councillor Church?
Lord Mayor, can we confirm whether the residents saw those amended plans?
I'll put the question through to Ms. Bisson.
Through you, Lord Mayor, they were sent by email to all the objectors against this proposal, and it wasn't, I guess, notified in the sense that people were offered to provide comment through an official formal notification process. It was just provided to the objectors that amended plans had been submitted, and these were the plans that were going to be considered tonight for determination.
Thank you.
So just to be clear, it didn't go through a formal notification process. Was that because the changes weren't considered significant, or due to timing?
The decision to not re-notify at the time they were submitted was considered on the basis that it was reducing the impact to the surrounding area, and therefore in accordance with our notification policy, it's at officer discretion, and then last week it was they were delivered to the objections by email, and there's insufficient time to ask for comment. It was just to advise the objectors, if they were not already aware, that amended plans had been considered and submitted.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further discussion, councillors? If not, did you want to move your procedural motion now, Councillor Clausen, or did you?
Yes, please, Lord Mayor. And in doing so, I just explain the reasons for. I appreciate that the objectors were notified and provided an opportunity to review the plans, but it wasn't a formal notification process that would allow for the engagement of neighbours in a longer time period than just the distance between last week and tonight. So I'd prefer that a proper re-notification took place. I appreciate, officers have made the right decision on the basis that the impacts were lesser of these updated plans, but given the degree of community sensitivity, I think the right thing to do is to make sure that everybody sees the updated plans.
So it's a procedural motion, councillor. Could you please restate your motion?
The motion is that we lay this item on the table to allow for re-notification of the amended plans to occur.
Do I have a seconder for that motion? Councillor White. I'll put the motion without debate. All those, and I'll take it by division because it's a DA. All those in favour, please raise your hand and please leave it there till I finish going through the process. Councillor Clausen, Councillor White, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Winnie Bartz, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Byrne, Councillor Nelms, Councillor Rufo. All those against, please raise your hand. Councillor Church, Councillor Robinson, Councillor Luke. I declare that motion carried. Because there has been a decision on this part of the motion, the two substantive motions will lapse for now, but I'm sure there'll be an opportunity to discuss this item again. Councillors, that actually ends our agenda this evening. Actually, I've got Councillor Clausen and Councillor Mackenzie indicating they'd like to speak. I'll go first with Councillor Clausen.
Lord Mayor, as indicated before, I'd like to move that we recommit item number 14 for debate. And I appreciate, so in the Code of Meeting Practice, clause 58 outlines when a motion can be recommitted. We originally, there was a motion before us to consider approval. That was lost. There wasn't a foreshadowed motion raised, but a further motion was considered, and ultimately the development was rejected. I believe that there was an alternative approach and that councillors might have overlooked another way of potentially addressing this issue, and so I'd be more comfortable if councillors were of the mind to temporarily reconsider that matter and consider a proposal that I could put forward that may address that situation and allow us potentially to have an approvable development.
Certainly. So a motion to recommit does need a seconder. Is that a seconder?
Oh, Lord Mayor, this is inappropriate. The matter's been dealt with and voted on by the council.
Do I have a seconder for a motion to recommit? Just 1 second. I just need to chair this meeting. So I need a seconder before I can go any further. Is that you, Councillor Mackenzie? Certainly. Okay. A motion to recommit has to go to a vote of council. So if you don't want to recommit the motion based on the reasons the councillor has just stated, you don't have to recommit the motion, but it is in our Code of Meeting Practice. If a councillor wants to try and recommit a motion for whatever reason, they can actually ask the council to recommit it and reconsider it. It can be whether or not anything that the councillor has to say on the motion may not sway you in any way, but as our Code of Meeting Practice allows it, as a meeting chair, I need to allow this process. So the motion to recommit is before us, and I'm happy if councillors wanted to discuss the fact that we are recommitting, but Councillor Clausen obviously has something he wants to add to that discussion. You may not want to hear it, so you do not have to vote for it. Councillor Elliott?
It would just help me to make a decision if I could get an idea of what Councillor Clausen wants to do. I mean, it's just, we're flying blind here. I have no idea why he wants to recommit it. Could be quite happy to vote to recommit, but can you give us a hint as to what it is you want to do?
Certainly. I'll ask him to explain the reasons.
Apologies, I had understood that a recommittal was a procedural motion and wasn't sure that I was able to debate at length the rationale, but happy to explain, and I've just posted in the chat as well. Councillors will recall that the motion was defeated on the basis there was concerns particularly about the overnight boarding of animals. It is a real shame in my belief that we have now rejected this development outright, despite only having concerns with the ancillary use. I'm proposing that we change the condition of consent to ban or prevent the overnight commercial boarding of all animals, i.e. to remove that ancillary use so that we can still approve and proceed with the vet clinic as outlined. I think that the refusal, and we didn't have an alternate motion, it was addressed in a clumsy way. I think that this is a neater way of addressing this issue, allowing us hopefully to have a development that is supportable by all councillors, and that this addresses all of the concerns raised by councillors in the debate, whilst removing that component that caused some concern, particularly being the overnight boarding of animals.
So the motion is procedural, and normally the reasons are stated when they're moving it, but I think it's probably clearer now to all councillors of why you're asking to recommit. I have a mover and a seconder, so I'll actually take a vote and I will do it by division. So please just keep your hands there so I can have that recorded. So I have the procedural motion to recommit, moved and seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Councillor Nelms, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Elliott, Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor White, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Byrne. All those against, please raise your hands. Councillor Church, Councillor Robinson, Councillor Luke. I declare that motion carried.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I'd like to move the substantive motion as I foreshadowed and included in the chat. That is the officer's recommendation with the amendment to clause 17 to remove or to clarify that there is to be no animals that are commercially boarded overnight.
And what about Councillor Rufo's changes?
Apologies, confirming, happy to include, so the officer's recommendation as amended by Councillor Rufo's amendment in relation to parking with a further amendment to clause 17.
And that amendment is the one before us. Could you please read it out, Councillor?
Councillor Rufo's amendment as previously stated, and then the change to clause 17 would be to replace clause 17 in the conditions of consent with, quote, no animals are to be commercially boarded overnight, i.e. dogs and cats are to be temporary patients of the surgery only, and no more than 3 dogs and 3 cats are to be housed overnight at any one time. It's consistent with the originally proposed clause 17, minus the removal and clarification that cats can't be boarded overnight, and that the inpatients, the overnight inpatients, are to be the same numbers for cats and for dogs. So a substantial reduction. You'll recall that it was 12 originally.
And do I have a seconder? I did get a seconder, pardon me. That was Councillor White, wasn't it? Is that correct? Yes. And I will, would you like to speak further to the motion, Councillor?
Just very briefly, Lord Mayor, and I appreciate, this is an unusual procedural position to be in. I was supportive of the development in its original form, but having listened to the concerns of councillors, it appeared that there were 2 key areas of concern, the first of which being the parking issue, which we'd addressed quite neatly, I thought, by Councillor Rufo's amendment, and the second of which related to the overnight boarding of cats, which was an ancillary use. We heard in the debate that it wouldn't have been allowed had it been a standalone development in the B1 zone. By removing that component of the development in the conditions, we now have an entirely compliant development before us, and one that I hope is supportable by councillors to see a vet clinic in this location without the overnight boarding component.
Thank you, Councillor. I just want to make sure that I've got it right for council records. Councillor White, were you the seconder or no? Did I make a mistake?
I'm not sure if it was myself or Councillor Mackenzie.
Was it you, Councillor Mackenzie?
I don't recall whether it was me or not, to be honest.
Okay, no one's helping me out here tonight, are you? Okay, are you happy to second it, Councillor White? It's probably...
Yes, I am.
Okay, that's fine. That's good for the process of, I just wanted to make sure that was clarified for the process of actually having a discussion. I have a call from Councillor Rufo, and then from Councillor Elliott, and then from Councillor Mackenzie. Councillor...
Bringing this addition, I did, during my my conversation period, I did highlight that point, which was one of the conditions during operation and use of the development. And I asked that area, but the response that I got, I didn't feel that I didn't have an issue with that. But the removing of the boarding, I think is a good thing. So, and I support that amendment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Rufo. Councillor Elliott.
Yes, thank you, Lord Mayor. I think this is a step in the right direction for residents, but I wonder whether we should consider an alternative motion, which would be to lay this on the table so that we could have some more discussion with the residents prior to making a decision. So I'd like to foreshadow that.
Certainly. So how I will interpret that in the same way as Councillor Clausen previously is that you'd like the opportunity for other councillors who've listed to speak on this, and then you'd like me to come back to you to move a procedural motion at the end of having everyone having the opportunity to say something. Is that correct? Okay. Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I like this clause. I think it goes to the heart of some of my concerns, or my major concerns. I would just sort of reiterate, I guess, Councillor Elliott's comments. To me, the 3 dogs, 3 cats is a little bit arbitrary. I don't know if that's what that number's based on, whether it's consistent with the proponent, whether that would even be something that the proponent would be interested in. It's consistent with their business model or what have you. But I think the idea of fencing commercial boarding at the site would, again, address a lot of the concerns that I have in relation to this.
Thank you, Councillor. Is there a technical reason that I'm not aware of either around the number of dogs and cats yes, Councillor Clausen?
Lord Mayor, it's probably a good question, and it would be good to seek Ms. Bisson's advice, particularly around a procedural motion to lay this on the table, given that moments ago we had refused this development. I just understand the process and options there. But in relation to the 3, just to be clear where I chose that from, clause 17 of the officer's recommendation of the conditions of consent is that no more than 3 dogs be allowed overnight. And so I have just copied from the original officer's recommendation and applied the same principle for the number of dogs and cats. I would have assumed that that would have been based on the applicant's application about the reasonable number of dogs to be kept overnight. But the 3 is from the officer's recommendation.
Standing from the report and the presentations to us is that the most contentious part of this DA, aside from the parking issue, is the ancillary use and the overnight boarding, which I think most councillors, even during the public voice, were concerned about in a not just any residential area, in a residential area that was now much more densely populated and was quite a unique situation to the city in terms of overnight animal boarding that was ancillary to the actual veterinary practice. So it might actually be worth Councillor Elliott's suggestion. What I would just explain with a recommittal of a motion is that it's exactly that it is just an extension of the debate and with new information. So obviously we've had a previous discussion. It would fresh in people's minds. That's often why it's allowed under the Code of Meeting Practice to have a recommittal while it's fresh in our minds and actually before us. But it doesn't lock any councillor into any previous decision, because this is a Development Applications Committee meeting, and the procedures and the guidelines under the Office of Local Government is decisions aren't made until it's not recommended to make any final decision until you've heard all the discussion. And you have all the information. So it's just an extension really of the initial debate. If that clarifies that for you, Councillor. Yes? No? I'm not getting any response from Councillor Clausen. Councillor Church.
Lord Mayor, I'd support laying this on the table. I think we're just plucking numbers out of the air now, and we're not consulting with the residents. And I think this is an important DA that needs a bit more time and consideration.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mackenzie, have I gone to you?
Yes, several times, Lord Mayor.
I see your name on there. So have I covered? Yes, I have covered you off. Councillor Duncan.
Lord Mayor, yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the opportunity for this item to be recommitted under our Code of Practice. I think that's great, because I think Councillor Clausen and Councillor Rufo in particular raised a couple of really important areas there, one being the parking, the other one being the overnight boarding of animals, which I think was the primary concern of most of us. I think it was well acknowledged that the plan of management prepared by council officers is strong. So I'd actually support the replacing clause 17. as proposed.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Clausen?
Lord Mayor, if it makes it easier for councillors, perhaps a further simplification to the amended motion would just be the start of that sentence. So replace clause 17 with no animals are to be commercially boarded overnight, i.e. dogs and cats are to be temporary patients of surgery only, full stop. The rest of the sentence probably isn't necessary, and that might provide greater clarification for everybody. It's much plainer then.
Councillor White, are you happy with that change to the substantive motion? Yes? Okay. All right, so that's a change to the substantive motion that it deals with the 3 cats and the 3 dogs. Is there any further discussion, councillors? Councillor Elliott.
Yes, thank you, Lord Mayor. And I just wanted to clarify something in order for people to make an informed decision. The plan of management has been prepared by the applicant, as I understand it, not by council officers. So if we're expecting that this plan of management is strong because it's prepared by us, it's actually submitted and then we approve that. So it's submitted by the vet clinic, the proponent, unless I'm mistaken, but that's usually the practice. And so we don't, you know, they submit what they believe is something that they can achieve. Just on the matter of laying it on the table, I appreciate that Councillor Clausen brought it back for discussion, and that amendment that he's proposing does provide us with an opportunity for a different path. So that's very useful. But I think that deciding on that path right now, without going back to the residents and having a bit more time to think about it, this is a significant impacts to people. And it's also a significant impact on the applicant if we reject it, which we've already done tonight, obviously. So with this new information, this new opportunity, wouldn't it be wise to go back to talk to the vet clinic? They might say that the business isn't viable without the cat boarding. So we don't know any of those answers tonight. So that's why I propose we lay it on the table. I'm not trying to dismiss what Councillor Corriston said. I think that could well be a very good amendment. But we haven't spoken to the vet clinic. We don't know whether or not that reduces their viability as a business. We don't know whether it reduces their customer base because they have people who are relying on them for cat boarding. We don't know any of those questions. So I think it's important for us to perhaps lay this on the table, bearing in mind that I think Councillor Clausen's amendment is probably a good one, but I don't actually know. And I feel uncomfortable making a decision on behalf of an applicant about how they run their business before I've actually had a chance to talk to them about that.
Certainly. What I might do, just to cover off the process, I might seek a substantive foreshadowed motion if this motion is also defeated, because I can't predict sitting here how all these different votes will go. And we didn't have one last time. And I believe last time the motion was moved after the fact by Councillor Church. So you may or may not want to do that again, but I think it's just a wise practice for us going forward. It would be a motion that outlined reasons for refusal, just in case the Councillor Clausen and Councillor White's motion is defeated, and also just in case the motion that Councillor Elliott has given intent to move, which is procedural, that this item lays on the table, is also defeated.
I'm happy to move that, Lord Mayor. Thank you.
So that's a substantive foreshadowed motion for refusal, as similar to the one that you've already moved this evening. Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Luke, thank you. Is there any further discussion, councillors? If not, I will go back to Councillor Elliott.
I'm sorry, Lord Mayor, I think I've already spoken.
Oh,
I do
well,
apologise.
what my understanding was that you wanted to move a procedural motion.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Yeah. So
I was reading the chat thinking that I'd put my name down again by accident. Yes, I'd like to move a procedural motion to, given the, in light of potential new information, that we lay this item 14 on the table in order to consult properly with the applicant and the residents.
And could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Church. Great, thank you. All in favour of the procedural motion, please raise your hand. Councillor Robinson, Councillor Rufo, Councillor Church, Councillor Elliott, Councillor McKenzie, Councillor White, Councillor Clausen, Councillor Nelms, Councillor Byrne, Councillor Duncan. All those against, please raise your hand. Councillor Luke. The motion will lay on the table with further consultation on this substantive motion with the objectors and the proponent. Councillors, unless there's any other items, this will conclude our agenda for DAC meeting this evening. So I will close the meeting at 7:52 p.m.